So the thesis of this video is that it is not only necessary to objectify people, but I would say that it's fundamental to life. And now you might say, well, I don't objectify people. I'm actually super moral and super good. I don't use people as objects, right? And that's generally the Kantian view of things, where the bumper sticker is something like, people are an end in themselves. They're not a means to an end. You can't, take somebody as if they're a lemon and just squeeze the juice out of them and then just toss them away like a thing. How dare you treat people like a thing, you monster, you Nazi. Well, so here's the thing. There's some truth to that, right? It doesn't feel great to be used, taken advantage of, right? And of course, Kant's little bumper sticker there makes sense to people intuitively. No one wants to be, taken as the thing and then used and then discarded, right? It goes against the subjective feeling of being very, 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 very valuable, right? So valuable, in fact, that you can't even say very anymore. Right? There's like this infinite universe inside your head, right? If you feel like you're the center of the world, your feelings are galactic, right? They're very powerful. They feel significant. They feel immense, right? So of course you don't want people to use you, right? It makes sense. The thing is that when I think of somebody like Kant, I imagine somebody on a college campus, let's say. They're a very handsome person, and maybe they got a guitar and they're sitting next to somebody that they have a crush on, and they'll say, well, you know what? I don't even see you as a body. Like, I guess like when I look at you, I just see like, I see that like there's so much beauty inside you. There's like a universe inside you, like all these other people, they just think like, they think about your body and stuff, but not me. I love so much, and I just love connection so much that I only see people's inner beauty, right? And then the other person's like, oh my God, they're so like romantic, and they see me for me. They see me for who I am. Oh my God, right? So that's a kind of very encouraging thing to hear from somebody, right? That they're not just using you like some kind of monster, right? That they see you for who you are. Oh, isn't that beautiful? The thing is that I don't really see that happening really at all on a regular basis in the world. In practice, people do use each other as instruments. My working life is full of it. My working life is being used as an instrument, right? And even in small exchanges and conversations, you're using the person for entertainment. Usually you want to get their perspective. You want to glean a little information, feel a little better about yourself. I don't think these are necessarily wrong, but I think it's more important not to focus on this ideal that people never reach and say like, oh, that's the way to go. Although I think there's value to that, I think it's really important to clearly look at what is actually happening between people. And you might say, well, that's obvious. Everyone knows that we're just using each other. And, there's an element of truth to this. I mean, I almost feel like this video essay is like me going around and saying something like, I go around the city and I go to washrooms, I go to bathrooms, I go to restrooms, but not seeing a lot of washing going around in these washrooms. Not a lot of bathing in bathrooms. And people are like, yeah, we know that's just, it's kind of gross. We don't like to talk about that. Of course, like everyone is doing it all the time, right? Going in these washrooms and washing up, right? It's not a part of life that we want to celebrate or really look at. So, why even bring it up? The reason it's important is because I think people actually start to believe that objectifying people is something that they don't do. That isn't really something we should be doing at all. It's like, okay, but that is what is happening. So how do we make sense of it, right? And so I want to start with the etymology of the word object and subject, because I think it it helps ground the conversation as a nice place to start from. So the etymology of the word object comes from the Latin obicere or obiccio, right? Made of ob, so in front of or against, and iacere or iaccio, to throw, iaccio, right? And iaccio is from the Proto-Italic giaccio, right? And of course, the root of the Proto-Italic would be Proto-Indo-European, which is a language that is hypothetically something that's people spoke many, many thousands of years ago, out of which a huge variety of languages arose, from India all the way to Spain. And what I really like about this root of giaccio, the Proto-Italic giaccio, and of course object, is that it feels like an onomatopoeia. Like it sounds like what it is. So this is going to take a little bit of convincing, right? But just hear me out on this, okay? So think of giaccio. And now the Proto-Indo-European root is je. So je is to throw. Think of je, right? And the way that I've seen it transliterated is like Y-E-H or H-Y-E-H. Now these have very special ways of being pronounced, these different letters, right? There's thousands of different ways to pronounce, let's say like 26 letters in the alphabet, right? That there's way more sounds that we make than there are letters, which is why, you have these very special notations. But anyway, when I think about throwing something, right? When I even think about something flying past my ear, it kind of makes like a, right? And just taking something, it's like, right? And there are certain words that share this common root of je, which is to throw. Think about eject, jet, inject, reject, project. Je. And when you're trying to think about how language originated, you kind of have to think in the most simple way possible, I imagine, right? You take something and you're like, je. And the guy's like, oh yeah, je means to throw. And that might, be morphing into different things. Je might even be the object that you're throwing. But think about that. Project, reject, you push it away. Je. Or you project. Je. It goes to language is fun, right? And then we move on to subject, which is from the Latin subicere, right? So sub and iacere, or iaccio. So it's like underthrow. And the Proto-Indo-European roots of that are something like uppo. So when I think of simplicity, how could I, a monkey man, talk to another monkey man and get the idea of under or going beneath and behind? I would go something like whooppo, right? Going in, whooppo. So you got ja, the object, taking something and throwing it, manipulating it like a lemon, squeezing it out, right? And you got whooppo. So it's the throw, but inside your mind, man. That's your subjective consciousness, right? So you've got object and subject. An object is the external throwing, and then subject is trying to get at the fact that there's a lot going on in our heads, which is imaginative, but also active, right? We plan for throws. We imagine us throwing things at other people, right? And this is something that, you might even abstract into the idea that we have a life inside of our own heads, a subjective experience, a subjective consciousness, which is extremely valuable and is as rich as the external world. And so Kant looks at that and he's like, well, wait a minute. What really, really matters to me is my subjective consciousness, right? Like people who I see around me, like they're pretty much, I guess, kind of having the same experience that I am. And well, I want to honor that. There's nothing really wrong with that. But then you kind of come to the question, well, how do we come to this idea that there is this lofty idea, this inner value of people that needs to be respected? And well, to quote Nietzsche on this, he says, like the commencement of all great things in the world, It's thoroughly and continuously saturated with blood, right? There isn't really a very pretty story about how we got to this idea of like, respecting each other people, respecting each other's value, right? Because I want to say in my own experience, both in the way that I naturally act and the way I see other people acting, the most common way of interacting that I see is people treat each other kind of like obstacles and tools, right? And, when I first came to Canada, for example, I didn't really know how to speak English, but I did know how to draw. And I noticed that when I drew things for other people, well, they treat me nicer. They're like, hey, I'm going to give this guy affection because he gave me something that I like. And I'm like, okay, that makes sense. And then I've just seen that develop throughout the decades. So now I'm a professional artist and I do things for money on a regular basis. So people not only give me affection and respect and friendship, but they actually give me little points that I put into a little point box, my bank. And I go to my little point box and take all my little points. Then I give my points. I'm like, hey, here's my points. I've been a good member of society. Now can I have some food, please? Thank you. And, it's very rare to have the Kantian perspective where, you compose long poems about somebody, the depth of their soul's beauty. Not to say that doesn't happen, but, going back to the idea of subjectivity as the inner throw, well, I've noticed that as a way for me to feel better about my frustration with somebody that I can't do anything about, right? Someone who's, let's say, more powerful, or there's just no way for me to get back at them, right? It wouldn't even make sense. It's not a good use of my time. I entertain myself by imagining really cartoonishly violent things happening to them. So for example, this one guy in my building who's very rude to me, I imagine, a swarm of angry bees attacking him and him screaming in agony. The soul delights. Or imagining him tripping on a bunch of marbles and he's like, whoa, losing his. All right. Silly things like that. So it gives pleasure. And Nietzsche talks about this. He talks about the creditor and debtor relationship, which would be the basic way of people relating to each other. It's like, I've done something for you, now you owe me, and you give something to me, right? And David Graeber talks about this in his book of Debt, about how societies are built on debt. And if you want to have a social relationship with somebody, the idea that no one owes each other anything, that's like completely antisocial, right? Because if you owe someone a little bit of something, or they owe you a little bit of something, a little bit of something, then in that case, well, you always have a reason to see each other. It's like, oh yeah, yo, let me get you that N64 cartridge that I owe you, right? And they're like, oh yeah, thanks for helping me with that thing. I'll get you the thing, right? Something like that. There's always like a give and take, right? So it's not like that it's morally wrong to owe someone, although it's kind of transformed into that for reasons that are outside the scope of this video. But that creditor and debtor relationship is extremely basic, right? Of course, it's morphed into many different types of societies. It doesn't mean that there's going to be, this currency-oriented society like we have now. What Nietzsche points out is that, like, instead of a direct compensation to a creditor, sometimes the creditor would want something more than, let's say, money or land or chattel. His reward, like I talked about earlier with inner throwing, it's to make the person suffer, to feel the pleasure of violence, of hurting them. And I think this is actually a really common idea when you look at something like a mob boss, a mafia boss, right? Like, I've always found it strange. Like, why do they go and like hurt the person? I mean, I guess it's to tell them that they're serious, but like, if you really want to get your money back, you would do everything you can to make sure that person's healthy, right? That they have the ability to get you your money. You wouldn't hurt them, right? So there's, I guess there's just this anger. It's like, oh, I just want to feel better by hurting something else. And, you look in the animal kingdom, something like a baboon would hurt a conspecific, someone in their little tribe that is below them or is somewhat equal, right? They're not going to gun after somebody who's more powerful, because it at least makes you feel better. It's like, okay, well, at least I'm above someone else, right? At least I feel safe in knowing that my position in the world isn't that threatened. I'm not quite at the bottom. And, and then Nietzsche asks, like, why is it that people think that when they suffer, they've paid something off, right? This is a very common idea, right? Like, it's like, well, at least I'm suffering. At least I feel guilty for it. At least I'm doing that. So it's like I'm paying something off. And he's like, how does that make sense other than the idea that that inflicting suffering on someone is a kind of recompense, right? And when it comes to objectification, I find it really interesting how whenever people think that they haven't suffered enough for something, they haven't sacrificed and suffered to get what they're respected for, they treat it as like not quite so worthwhile. So a concrete example, let's say you're extremely beautiful. You just have this face and this body that everyone just, loses their minds over. They gawk at you and they just want to be around you. They want to give you things, right? You say, well, they're just objectifying me. They don't understand all the work I've put in, studying the economic history of Babylon in the 7th century BC. And it's like, well, the pleasure that you're giving to people, the value you're giving to society, well, it's apparently more than enough with what you have. But it's like, but if I sacrifice, if I suffer, then I shall finally have paid off my debt to society, right? There's other reasons, but I just find it really interesting how insightful that is on Nietzsche's part about this really ugly part of human nature. I mean, if you go back to the 5th century BC and, the first document of Roman law, it says there in one traditional version, he who hasn't got coinage shall pay in flesh. It's like, well, like, how does that make sense other than this idea that, you need to suffer to pay what you owe because that feels good for the person inflicting the suffering? Not a very pretty picture, right? But then Nietzsche has this amazing quote where he says, alas, reason, seriousness, mastery over the emotions, all these gloomy, dismal things which are called reflection, all these privileges and pageantries of humanity, how dear is the price that they have exacted? How much blood and cruelty is the foundation of all good things? And now when we get into the foundation of all good things, there's this really interesting theory put forth by Miguel de Cervantes in the early 17th century. There's this longer story called the Deceitful Marriage, but within that, there's this guy who he's really sick in the hospital. It's not really clear if this is a delusion or a fever dream. I mean, you kind of assume it is, but so he's sitting in the hospital and he's listening to these two dogs talking, and one of the dogs is reflecting on the fact that he can talk. So it's not just like, they're just two dogs talking. They're like, yeah, we're dogs, and it's so weird that we can talk, right? And one of the dogs, he's very rude about everyone and everything. He's always gossiping and attacking this person and the other and criticizing them. And the other dog is like, well, like, what is it with this viciousness in your language? And the other dog is like, well, the thing is, I've noticed that language itself is kind of a way to attack people. It's like a weapon, and what's really interesting is that there's certain contemporary researchers of language where they've done empirical studies and noticed that about 2/3 of language is just gossip, right? Like what he calls, I think, reputation management, where, in order to have a functioning society, you need to be able to, categorize and rank people based on their behavior. It's like, well, so-and-so did this. It's like, oh yeah, that ain't right. Right? You kind of figure out like, how are people feeling about actions, right? How do we punish people's reputation for bad behavior, right? You're not just going to go and club them, right? I mean, sometimes you might, but you want to have a working dialogue where, people express each other's feelings and they criticize. They're like, well, this is how things should be. This is how things shouldn't be, right? So language is something that's very, very much, according to this theory, about hurting, about using it as a tool, ironically as an object, as a right? you throw things. And, I mean, I even started this video essay by attacking Kant, right? And another thing that I like about this story, The Deceitful Marriage, is that it portrays what I would say is a more realistic, although almost comically formulated, but a more realistic portrayal of how people really behave with each other. So somebody like Martha Nussbaum might look at a D.H. Lawrence novel, right, and say like, oh, isn't it beautiful that you have two lovers and they're lying down in bed and one of them puts their head on the stomach of the other lover. It's like, well, that's objectification, but it's so beautiful. They're in love. Objectification can't be all bad. You see, there's love. In the end, there's love. And Cervantes is like, yeah, well, kind of, but hold on. Right, so I want to tell this story. I think it's a really fun story. So I'm not going to use their Spanish names because they're a little awkward. You've got, let's say, Charlie and Stephanie. Although Stephanie's name does sound kind of exotic. It's Donna Estefania, mi amor, right? Okay, but you got Charlie and Stephanie. Charlie's having dinner and he sees Stephanie and a friend and he's like, damn, you're looking good though. But the thing is, Stephanie has a veil over her face and he's like, please, I need to see you. And because he sees her beautiful snow white hand, and he's like, I gotta see you. You seem so beautiful. You seem so fit, but I want to see that face. Let me see that face, right? And she's like, no, get out of here, get out of here. He's like, please, please, right? And he's like, all right, fine. Listen, get your people, follow my people. You'll come to my place, and I'll let you see what I look like. Okay, finally. And he's like, oh my God, thank you. And he promises mountains of gold to her, which kind of reminds me of e-girls, right? They'll get, thousands of dollars in a single day from some desperate person. So Charlie goes over to Stephanie's house and, he notices she's living pretty good. She's kind of got this mansion. He's like, man, she's looking pretty good. Got a mansion. I mean, if I get in here, la dolce vita, come on, So, he starts bragging about how great he is. He's like, well, I guess I'm like a really strong and like rich dude. I mean, like people don't mess with me and, I'm pretty fit, whatever. It is what it is, right? It makes her all these promises and, she listens, but she's like, I don't know. She's not really buying it, right? And the thing is, he just doesn't give up. He's obsessed with this woman. She's so beautiful. It turns out she's rich too. And finally, she tells him, you know what? Okay, listen. Now, I'm no saint. You might see me as a pretty woman. I'm no saint. I got my flaws. But I guess what I really want from a man, what I'm really looking for, I guess I just want someone to protect me, Just want someone to take care of me, right? I just want to be, I just want a man to protect me and we just like build a life together, I guess that's just what I'm looking for. Yeah, I mean, that's all I want, really. And he's like, but I can totally do that for you, right? You can run the household for me and, I'll do my thing, get my money, we'll live a good life together, right? So, they get married and, he goes to our house with, he packs his bags with, his treasure chest of all his cool stuff, a bunch of cash, jewelry, nice clothes, all of his nice stuff. He's like, what else am I going to need? I'm married to this beautiful woman that's got a mansion, dude. And she wants to be a housewife. Dude, I've got a maid. That's all I need, right? So he gets in there. He's like, oh, nice carpets, not bad. Some nice silver candlesticks, okay. And they have a maid. Ooh, breakfast in bed, up at 11. Ooh, maybe a nap in the afternoon. Ooh, baby. Oh, and get this. His shirts were washed in water, perfumed with orange blossoms. Oh my God, this life is too good, right? Some delicious meat stew, right? So, things are going great. This first week, he's living the good life. But But. After a week, there's a knock at the door. Turns out the people who showed up, they're like, what's going on here? Who is this guy? Right? And it's like, Stephanie, I trusted you with being a house sitter. Why'd you bring this guy in? You kind of betrayed my trust, right? That's Donna Clementa. Donna Clementa, I'm going to call her Clementine. So Clementine's upset. She's like, she trusted her friend, right? So, and Clementa showed up with this other guy that she's trying to marry. So Stephanie, takes Charlie aside and she's like, oh, listen, I know this is crazy, but actually what's happening is that, Clementine, she's seeing this new guy and they want to get married, but she's not sure if he's just looking to get, a rich wife. And so she's going to pretend that this is her house. And then she's going to tell him after they're married. And, if he gets angry, then she'll know that he's not the one. Something like that, okay? All right, so we got to get out of here. We can't be anymore. And Charlie's like, oh, fine, okay. So then Stephanie and Charlie, they leave. Charlie's very upset. They leave and they go to one of Stephanie's friends. They're going to stay there for a while until until all this blows over and they figure it out. And once they get there, Charlie's just furious. He's arguing with Stephanie all the time. He's like, what's going on? This doesn't make sense, blah, blah, blah. And, at a certain point after Stephanie goes out in the town for a while, Charlie's at home and he meets with the mistress, and the mistress is like, hey, like, I heard you guys arguing, like, what's going on? And Charlie tells him, and then the mistress of the house is like, dude, that mansion, that's not Stephanie's, that's Clementine's house. Like, what are you talking about? Charlie's like, wait a minute, so you're saying that Stephanie is just some broke gold digger? And then at this point he's like suicidal, right? But then going through these suicidal thoughts, he's like, wait a minute, God says you're not supposed to commit suicide, so damn it, I can't do that. But what I can do is get vengeance. So he takes his dagger. He's like, I'm going to teach Stephanie a lesson. So, he goes after Stephanie to, teach her a lesson. And, on the way, he's like, you know what, I'm going to go give Clementine a piece of my mind too. He changes his mind. He's like, I know, I'm just going to go back home. And he goes back home. And what do you know? Stephanie robbed all of his valuables from his treasure chest and absconded. She's gone. And then later when he's telling this story to his friend, it turns out that all of his expensive jewelry and chains, well, they're actually like fake. Most of this stuff is just like, ripoffs and knockoffs. So he scammed her who scammed him. There's this really great, I guess you'd call it a proverb or a saying, which is, Don Simeke thought he would deceive me with his one-eyed daughter, and by God, I'm crippled on one side. Right? So it's like everyone's kind of got an angle and they're pretending just to get an advantage, but all the other people are pretending. So it's kind of like this really messy game. I kind of like Cervantes in that cynicism. And, I like this story too, because it shows that even though women did have a very subordinate role in society, they're not without their ambition and their willingness to deceive and bamboozle and take advantage of and treachery. Because even Clementine, when she's complaining about like, I can't rely on a friend, really she just wants like a thing to take care of her house. She doesn't care about really, I guess, the struggles that Stephanie has, right? She's worried about herself. And I just find it interesting how when I look at feminists like Simone de Beauvoir, she doesn't really seem to have too much of a self-awareness of like her own vindictive nature, right? She talks about revolution, but you look at Mao's fourth wife, I think Jiang Qing, something like that, and she's like a really vindictive, power-hungry person, and she even like tortured people who slighted her. So the lesson I learned from that is like, don't mess with anybody, even if they seem like a really nice and kind person. You never know, right? So you just got to be careful around other people, right? That to me is the lesson to learn here. Don't be unkind to anyone because they're gonna get you, buddy, right? Don't burn bridges because they're gonna set you on fire. When it comes to more modern iterations of feminism, so someone like Nancy Bauer, who I like because she even talks about objectification as like this incoherent concept. It's like you can't really get heads or tails with it, right? Like doesn't really have much analytical power. And she gives, real world examples. So, she talks about Lady Gaga, who has this video where she's dressed, provocatively, scantily, right? And she's showing off a really nice body. She's pretty, She's thin, well-proportioned, and that's Nancy's language or Bauer's language, not mine, right? Even though, of course, I totally agree, right? And when Bauer looks at Lady Gaga and Lady Gaga's explanation of this, well, she's like, well, the thing is, I'm actually like analyzing the position that like I'm putting myself in. So it's like this analysis and interstitial switching. Okay, I'm making the last part up, but basically it's like this kind of not really believable thing, right? It reminds me of being in art school where people would write pages of just gobbledygook, right? Just because they can't just write down like, oh yeah, I did this because the colors look kind of cool. Makes them sound dumb, right? And no one wants to sound dumb because you get less respect, you get less money, less opportunities, you starve and die. So you can't be dumb because you die. And Bauer looks at this, she's like, well, it actually just kind of sounds like she's using self-objectification for her benefit. And I'm thinking like, yeah, that's clearly what's happening, but you can't just say it, right? It's kind of like saying, instead of going to the washroom, I'm going to fill in the blank, right? It's ugly, it's gross, right? Lady Gaga can't just go out and say, well, so here's the thing. I'm actually like way more beautiful than most people and more talented. And so what you're going to do is you're going to look at me and enjoy me and pay me. How's that? Right? And I don't know if that'll go over quite as well as saying like, I'm actually like critically analyzing it by embodying it. And so I'm kind of like working within the system to challenge norms by looking at the way that this actually empowers me, right? So, that sounds fake. It's also like a little neater. It's prettier, right? And Bauer talks about her own daughter, and she's like, well, my daughter, she's the kind of girl who, as a form of empowerment, well, she might, go around blowing dudes, sucking dudes off left and right, and she'll see it as empowerment. I found it really interesting how Bauer talks about the sadistic element of women's empowerment, of noticing that they have a lot of power over men, and then using that sadistically, just the pleasure of having power. And I like that level of honesty, but it makes it really problematic when we talk about, the opposite of objectification. It doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be getting a good deal, right? Like you might have someone else turned into a subject, but that might actually mean that they know that there's great sensitivity inside the other person that they can exploit, right? It creates a theory of mind. It's like, oh, like I have all this power to inflict suffering on other people, and I'm going to use it. Power, right? It's a little ugly, eh? But that's not to say that it's all bad. The thing is that there's like a fundamental tension between autonomy and morality. So what I mean by this is, again, when you look at someone like Simone de Beauvoir, she talks a lot about freedom. Her and Sartre talk about freedom, right? Like we've been oppressed as women for so long, like we want freedom. Right. And she talks about equality, an egalitarian political project. But then, she kind of notices like, well, even in socialist organizations, there's a lot of exploitation going on. There's a clear hierarchy. Women are being used as servants. And Beauvoir also talks about how, she wants power and privilege. She's like, men aren't going to give up their privilege easily. You got to fight for it. And I think, well, what does it mean to want freedom, right? Like real freedom, to not have to serve anybody, right? To want autonomy. That sounds pretty appealing to me, but like Nietzsche says, autonomous and moral are mutually exclusive. So what does it mean by that? We want to look at the way in which conscience formed, or more basically, like how can you promise something to somebody? And Nietzsche says that forgetfulness is the sentinel and nurse of psychic order, repose, and etiquette. So it's necessary to forget, right? You can't just have all your painful and horrible and traumatic experiences just constantly imprinting on your brain, right? It's going to drive you crazy, right? He says there's no happiness, no gladness, no hope, no pride, no real present without forgetfulness, right? It makes sense, right? Like to be able to focus, to be able to look towards the future, you need to have kind of like, you need to excrete those memories. He talks about being unable to forget as a kind of dyspepsia, right? You're not digesting things properly. You're not incorporating them. right? And so making promises is an active refusal to forget. So how does that happen, right? Well, he talks about it as like a kind of social straitjacket, right? You're made calculable by, and all the customs, the rules, the hardness, the despotism, right? Like you have to fall in line, right? Because that's how society works. It's about being subordinate to the moral order that keeps society integrated, right? And he talks about all these horrible tortures that we're so familiar with from hundreds of years ago, where you would be traumatized into realizing, like, if you step out of line, this is what's going to happen to you, right? You have this like images burned in of people like screaming in agony, their bodies just destroyed. And someone like Foucault would argue that instead of us becoming like gentler and kindler, it's like, oh, and by kindler I mean kinder, instead of this gentleness and kindness coming out upon us, he's saying like, well, it's not so much that it's better exactly, but it's just different, right? Like when you had these horrible spectacles of torture in the public square, there wasn't really that much control over the event, right? Like you would have people kind of turn against the state for punishing this person. Maybe they thought the punishment was too severe. They might storm the scene and take over, and the king or whatever, they would lose face, right? If the people disagreed. And so, it's kind of been more subterranean. It's been taking away from these like reactive emotions, right? To have more control. So when I think about the way that people are punished now, well, it's all hidden. They're far away in these court systems. You don't really see them. Maybe you see stuff about them in the news, maybe some court photos or clips, but it's all very sedate and regimented and organized, right? And there's an even greater surveillance of everybody. People are kept in line in more sophisticated ways. You really have to get inside people's heads, right? With something more elegant than just like traumatizing them to stay in line, right? There's different ways. And, Nietzsche points out that like the richer and stronger a country is, the more they can just be like, whatever, we don't need to be like all like in a frenzy and, like punishing people and like cutting their hands off or whatever. It's like, we can handle it. Our society is strong enough to have a couple of crazies running around here and there. But so anyway, like when Nietzsche sees this, he's like, well, after all these, tens of thousands of generations of this moral straitjacket, we've taught people how to, we've painfully burned in this idea of memory and, people sticking to their word, right? Making promises for the future, making people calculable, right? Like having a will, right? Having a will you control, a strong will where you say like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to promise a future for you. You can count on me, right? Making people reliable, responsible, right? Creating responsibility. He's like, well, it was an ugly process, but now we have this ripe fruit that we can pluck, which is the sovereign individual, right? Like having sovereignty where you make decisions, you take responsibility for your actions. He sees ironically that level of autonomy, that level of freedom is actually kind of antisocial, right? So again, when I think about Beauvoir, it's like she wants this freedom, but you might have this freedom of, traveling the world, banging hot people. That's, she's really into like sleeping around with attractive people, right? And, writing stuff and just talking, reveling in the beauty of thought and history, having lovely carpets, breakfast in bed at 11, right? So kind of Charlie's vision, right, of this beautiful life. But here's the thing, someone has to do that for you. You basically need servants to take care of that. And what I like about Nietzsche is that he's quite plain about this. He's like, you know what? Society is a pyramid. You can have people at the top, the best of the best. And most people who are average, they're just going to have to serve those people. That's just the way it is, always has been. Extremely politically incorrect, right? Because egalitarianism is sort of the reigning idea. So, the quote that I want to say from Nietzsche here about memory, he says, when man thinks it necessary to make for himself a memory, he never accomplishes it without blood, tortures, and sacrifice. The most dreadful sacrifices and forfeitures, among them the sacrifice of the firstborn, the most loathsome mutilation, for instance, castration, the most cruel rituals of all the religious cults, for all religions are really at bottom systems of cruelty, all these things originate from that instinct which found in pain its most potent mnemonic. So I find this really interesting that religions are at bottom all about cruelty. So we go back to Kant, and it's like, well, if Kant really wants us to stop using people as objects, right? To not use them just as instruments, to see them as ends in themselves. Just imagine how much of your self-interest you have to kind of like contort and beat down, right? And hurt just to get to that level. There's all this cruelty. And, generally this is something that's hidden. But there's people on YouTube, very popular people like Kevin Samuels, who refuse to hide any of this, right? And I think part of their popularity is owing to that fact. Samuels just has no patience for any sort of niceties, like, trying to mask what things really are. He takes a lot of flack for it. It's all about, that's such a toxic perspective, how could you, right? That kind of thing. But I mean, he makes some really valid points about just how things are, right? And I think because he does that, people are like, oh, so you're saying that because that's the way things are, that's the way they should be? And he's like, well, look, I'm just saying this is how things function. You have two options. You can either recognize that this is how things work and then make your decisions of where you want to be in this, social hierarchy. Are you willing to make the sacrifices necessary to succeed? Or are you going to be idealistic and say, I refuse all this, people should be better, right? I'm going to moralize and chastise them, right? And, I'm not saying that there isn't any room for moral chastisement, but how can we get to any kind of change in behavior if we don't really recognize what's happening? And in order to recognize what's happening, you need to have conversations with hundreds, thousands, millions of people and see what they're thinking, right? And then maybe get them to change their mind, right? And Kevin does this, like, to his credit, he has conversations with just random people, everyday people, on a regular basis, and he seems to always need to teach them the same thing. And so, for example, he'll say something like, you're not special, right? He'll tell that to people, and it might just seem like a cruel thing to do, but I think what he's fighting is the fact that people have been so enamored with this Kantian idea that, it's what's inside that really counts. And he's like, no, that's not how it works, right? Like, you may think that you're valuable, and, it's fine for you to think that. I mean, obviously you feel that, right? You have that universe inside you. But realistically, the reason you're not succeeding, and, obviously people call in because they have problems. They want his advice. They're like, how do I get the man of my dreams, the woman of my dreams? He's like, listen, the reason you're not succeeding is because you're not looking at reality, right? And so a really common one is like a woman will call and be like, well, basically what I want is I want to not work. I want to, travel the world. I want a luxurious lifestyle. I want a man that makes 6 figures, right? She's like, I'm entitled to that, aren't I? I'm a winning person. Why shouldn't I have that? He's like, okay, if that's what you want, you need to understand that you are being judged based on your number. Ooh, a number? How could you put a number on somebody? People are infinitely valuable, you Nazi, right? So that's the kind of thing that he tells people. And it's not a pretty thing to hear, right? But he loses his patience because, like, it's over and over and over and over again. It's the same thing where people are like, why am I not succeeding in the dating market, right? Like, I thought everybody is supposed to be judged based on who they are inside of the person. Can't you see me for me? And Kevin is like, no, that's not how it works, right? And in my impression, it seems that men who call into his channel are kind of more willing to accept this brutal fact that, like, they're generally going to succeed based on what value they bring to the other person, to the woman, right? Like, he needs to have his stuff together. He needs to have his life together, right? He needs to make money. He needs to be successful, right? He needs to be able to provide for his children, right? It's not rocket science, right? So I feel like men are more willing to just accept the fact that they're going to be a loser if they can't get to a certain level. And if they want, like a 10, like calls like an extremely beautiful woman, he has to understand that that comes with costs, right? Like, she's not going to pick him because she has options, right? There's a ton of people that want her, not so many people that want him, right? So you have to be realistic about what you can expect to get, right? And so he'll have these women call in, right? Like, wanting all these things. And he'll tell them, like, well, you're judged on a number, right? Like, what And that number is based on your value that you bring to a man. And, it's just, again, it's so ugly to talk about, but there's been dating websites where, a lot of the women who are on that site, they're like ugly, fat, or they have kids, right? So look, I'm not saying that they're not valuable people in themselves, but generally those are not the kind of people that, men with options will gravitate towards, right? And everyone wants the best, right? No one, is going to, or very few people, I think, would pick, like a 2004 Toyota Corolla versus like, a McLaren F1 or whatever, fancy car there is, right? They just don't have the money to get that, right? So, you can't be like, well, I just love everyone equally. I only look at who they are inside, right? Because really that's not what's happening in relationships, right? It's like you give something to the one person, the other person gives something to you. There's an equal exchange, right? It might not be like exactly equal. You might not be able to exactly price how things are going, but it's a give and take, and you have to be able to give, right? I don't get attention from women because I know that I'm not, attractive on many different levels. There's an average distribution. And he tells women like, look, you can get an average guy, but don't expect to get, a 6-figure earner, right? Those people are very rare. And unless you're really beautiful, and you really know how to be a traditional housewife or an executive wife and, provide for kids, most likely that's not going to happen. And of course you might say, oh, there's exceptions. I know people are different. But, he's talking to an audience of, millions of people, or, he has over 1 million subscribers on YouTube. And so because there's most people are average, right? So you can expect to get with an average person, right? Don't get your sights set too high and realize that what you get depends on what you can give to other people. Things are basically instrumental. And, you might say, well, that's a really depressing point of view because, if you are kind of a loser and you don't really have many options, you kind of have to just accept that you're a loser. And Kevin will, he has this like little soundboard he'll play where he'll be like, woof, woof, right? Which means like buy a dog and die alone. If you're not willing to compromise and change your expectations based on what you can get. Like Samuels's idea of numbers, like that's basic to rationality. So for example, the root of rationality is the Proto-Indo-European re, right? To count things, to weigh them, right? Like how much effort for this pleasure, right? How much this thing I like versus this thing I love. So it's like, you have people, it's like, well, this person gives me this much pleasure of beauty and this person gives me this much pleasure of conversation. And I rank them according to how valuable they are to me, to my needs, to my uses, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to treat them badly, right? But just recognizing this, I think, is fundamental. And I would go even deeper than this. I want to bring up the idea of the biology of life, right? Which I think is basically instrumental. You look at, let's say, something like a paramecium, right? So imagine like the usual, green cell with like the little hairs. You've got a green cell, and then inside the cell, the green cell, you've got a tiny orange blob, and a big orange blob. The tiny orange blob, the micronucleus, that's the germ cell, right? That's the one that gets mixed up with other micronuclei from other paramecia, right? They exchange, right? And they create new paramecia. Now the big one, the macronucleus, that's the workhorse of the cell. That's getting business done, right? But the micronuclei, the little orange blob, gets exchanged. Why is this important? Well, here's the thing. A paramecia, the paramecium, they can reproduce asexually, meaning they can just make copies of themselves for, a couple hundred generations. But after that, they're stuck because their biology tells them like, no, we need to find another one to conjugate with, right? To mix our DNA, right? Shuffle things around to make a new experiment, see if this one works out better than the last, right? There's an evolutionary advantage to shuffling things around, right? Doing a new experiment to see if things might improve, right? There might be some little protein adjustment that, creates a survival advantage. But when they recombine the little orange blobs, the micronucleus, what happens is that the macronucleus gets wiped out. So it's gone. The workhorse is gone. So, I say, why do I care about these cells? What does this matter for me? What does this matter for me? Right? Well, here's the thing. The workhorse, the macronuclei, well, that evolved into what we call somatic cells in animals, in mammals, in primates, in humans, right? And that's everything. My eyes are somatic cells, my beautiful eyes, my lips, my nose, my brain, my ears, my hands. Those are all somatic cells. And guess what? The germ cells, which were originally micronuclei, those turned into, sperm and eggs. And really, from the day we're born, all of our cells that are non-germ cells are programmed to die off eventually, right? They're programmed to do that. It's not that they can't continue living forever, right? Because bacteria, they can just keep living unless, they get smashed or, destroyed by radiation or something, right? They can adequately fix their DNA whenever it needs to be fixed, right? But we've been programmed to basically just help our little micronuclei, our germ cells, help them find, an egg and recombine and make a new person, a new creature, right? Make a new experiment. So we're kind of like, palanquins, like they used to carry the royalty around. So we're basically like just holding on to the royalty of our DNA, right? In our germ cells, which is just waiting to recombine. And so our whole bodies are just like instruments for this DNA recombination. Now you can fight against that, right? You can be like, well, I don't care what the DNA wants from me. But here's the thing, like you've been built to think about reproduction, about like, what do you do, right? How do you help DNA reproduce? Now you might be socially beneficial, right? You might not be interested in sex at all, but you might be interested in taking care of kids, or you might be interested in, writing a really great book that tells people, how to live their lives, or, opens up their eyes to the beauty of a tree with a painting, right? Something, you do something, right? That helps society, that helps nurture an environment for new creatures to come out, right? So you are kind of an instrument, and obviously like you will die, like you're built to die, right? You might not successfully, oh my God, sex on the mind, right? But you might not successfully pass on your own genes, but you might help with the genes of others, of your conspecifics, of your kin, or your tribe, or your nation, whatever. So you are instrumental. Now, you might choose to direct it towards, your own selfish needs, right? Which, it's not going to be really successful in the long run because you will die. So it's like, okay, you made yourself feel good and you're dead, now what? And I think this is really important to keep in mind because people like Nietzsche and Machiavelli, they're seen as like egoists, like, oh, they just want to cheat and lie and steal and get their way. But that's really not what they're talking about at all, right? So, for example, like Nietzsche, like his whole thing in Zarathustra, it's about, coming down from the mountain and like giving to others. He's just like overflowing with wisdom. And it's just like the joy of giving, like, it's like a powerful king. Like, I shall give you my riches, right? Because he wants to spread his power over time, right? And he successfully did that by his writings. Like I'm talking about him, right? He's lodged himself in my brain, right? Like a parasite, just living on. His ideas live on. And that's what he wants. Like he wants glory. He wants eternity. And the last thing I want to end on is this idea of glory and eternity. And, it's from a letter that Machiavelli wrote. And again, Machiavelli, he's seen as like, oh yeah, if you're Machiavellian, you plot and cheat and lie and steal to get power. But he's saying like, no, look, if you're going to be in politics, it's going to be messy. People are not going to play fair. And so you can't just expect to succeed if you always, play fair and, try to take the moral high ground. You will lose if you do that. So you have to understand to be flexible if you really, if you're required to do that. But his point was not to, just teach people like, oh yeah, just get stuff for yourself, just do whatever it takes to get your desires. No, he specifically wanted somebody who wanted to, accomplish greatness, to to create a nation, to create unity, to create something that lasts throughout time, throughout history, right? To make something fantastic, right? So he's talking to people who have this willingness to aspire to greatness, right? To do great things, and when you think about Machiavelli, you wouldn't necessarily think about somebody who, loves going to a garden and reading poetry and chatting with people. This idea of looking back to the ancients and, reading their poems, connecting with them as if they're, your best friends. Like that's getting in touch with greatness, right? Like these people have put so much thought and energy into, packaging something together for people to enjoy, for the rest of time, for thousands of years. Like that's so amazing, right? They didn't just, like Charlie, just like lounge and eat breakfast in bed. I mean, maybe they did that, right? There's nothing, intrinsically wrong with that. But the thing is that ends. Like you have a very limited lifespan. Like you have to, on some level, think of yourself as instrumental if you care about life, right? Because life is going to go on without you. And so it's like, what do you bring to the table? What do you bring to society, right? And that's not even like, oh, like you need to be good for us, right? But it's like there's pleasure in bestowing your gifts to society. I'm not sure if people see this as a gift. They're like, oh, when is this going to end, right? But this idea of looking at, especially literature as a great gift to people, of philosophy as a great gift to people, of even instrumentality, of using yourself as an instrument to create things, right, for others that people use you for. This is actually a great thing, and a necessary thing. So this is from Machiavelli's letter, and I want to end on this. When I leave the wood, I go to a spring, and from there to check my bird nets. I carry a book with me, Dante or Petrarch or one of the minor poets, perhaps Tibullus, Ovid or someone like that. I read about their infatuations and their love affairs, reminisce about my own, and enjoy my reveries for a while. Then I set out onto the road to the inn. I chat to those who pass by, asking them for news about the places they come from. I pick up bits and pieces of information and study the differing tastes and various preoccupations of mankind. It's lunchtime before I know it. I sit down with my family to eat such food as I can grow on my wretched farm or pay for with the income from my tiny inheritance. Once I've eaten, I go back to the inn. The landlord will be there, and usually the butcher, the miller, and a couple of kiln owners. With them, I muck about all day, playing card games. We get into endless arguments, and we constantly call each other names. Usually, we only wager a quarter, and yet you could hear us shouting if you were in San Castiano, in the company of these bumpkins. When evening comes, I go back home and go to my study. On the threshold, I take off my work clothes, covered in mud and filth, and put on the clothes an ambassador would wear. Decently dressed, I enter the ancient courts of rulers who would have long since died. There I am warmly welcomed, and I feed on the only food I find nourishing and was born to savor. I am not ashamed to talk to them and to ask them to explain their actions, and they, out of kindness, answer me. 4 hours go by without my feeling any anxiety. I forget every worry. I am no longer afraid of poverty or frightened of death. I live entirely through them. Machiavelli, my boy. Yeah, I love this because, Machiavelli feels like a friend to me, right? And if he wouldn't have, given up and kind of become a writer, which he did to pass the time, like he wouldn't have been able to pass on his gifts, his thoughts. When I read this, I just, yes, Machiavelli, my buddy, come on. Now, if I was to summarize my argument, right, I would say, you got jokjo. Take something and throw it for your own use. And you got sub-jokjo, oppa-jokjo. You got the oppa-jokjo and the jokjo, right? Oppa-jokjo. So, Kant would be like, jokjo, no jokjo. Oppa-jokjo, oppa-jokjo. right? So a subject, yeah, you got to look at the subjective. And then I would say to Kant, I would say, well, jokjo, open jokjo, open jokjo, jokjo. Yes, very good. It's all good. It's all good.